Hey, everybody, this is Robert Weissman with Public Citizen. Excited to have you join us from across the country. This is a webinar and stream to put people over the Pentagon. We've got an exciting program. We're going to run just shy of an hour. The program will start right now. We're going to kick off in just a moment with Representative Mark Pocan from Wisconsin. We'll conclude with Representative Barber II, our two champions on the People Over Pentagon Act, HR 1134. In between, we're going to have Reverend William Barber from the Poor People's Campaign, Debbie Weinstein from the Coalition for Human Needs, Bill Hartung from the Quincy Institute, and Karen Ornstein from Friends of the Earth. Going to be jam-packed with information about how you can take action and inspiration. So information, action, and inspiration all the way through. Quick couple words on top before I kick it over to Representative Pocan. We're in a strange moment. We're in a strange moment in this country where we're about to have a massive discussion about our spending priorities. And what's going to go mostly unremarked upon in that conversation is the fact is that we are fast racing to spending $1 trillion every year on weapons of war. $1 trillion on the War Department, the Pentagon. When we do that, we not only commit ourselves to empire, diminish our security, we steal money away from our other pressing priorities. We're going to hear a lot in the coming months about all the things we cannot afford to do. But there's all this money sitting at the Pentagon, being wasted at the Pentagon. And the People Over Pentagon Act is about that. It's a solution to that problem. It says, let's cut the Pentagon budget by $100 billion, and let's make that money available for other priorities. We're going to talk about how that works. We're going to talk about what those priorities are. And we're going to talk about how we move this legislation forward, take on the military-industrial complex, and actually get ourselves to the point where we're turning the corner on the Pentagon spending problem so that the budget goes down year over year, not endlessly up. Well, we have this legislation, HR 1134, the People Over Pentagon Act. It's introduced in the House of Representatives by two great champions for peace, justice, decency, and just plain common sense. And we're lucky to have both of them on with us today. We're going to hear at the top from Representative Mark Pocan, as I mentioned at the end, from Representative Barber II. So it'll be first Representative Mark Pocan from Wisconsin, a great leader on driving this issue forward, giving us a strategy to figure out how we take on the military-industrial complex, fearless and an organizer and a champion for us. And we're thrilled that he's with us here today. Representative Pocan, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for that very kind introduction. Thanks to everyone who's a part of this and people attending, listening in tonight. I think for the people here, we all know the Pentagon spends way too much money. It takes away from priorities that we could be spending on that really would directly benefit the American people. And we do it with zero accountability. And all of those together make for an awful lot that needs to get done. A number of years ago, Barber II and I, actually Barber at the time, I think, introduced the amendment. It was to cut 1% of the budget. I think that was 6 or so years ago, give or take. And that 1% got about 70 votes. So, you need 218 votes to pass anything in Congress. You couldn't even trim 1%. Well, thanks to working with the groups that are part of this call, we started getting a coordinated message, and we decided to go for a 10% cut. And because of the organized fight for that 10% cut, we got over 90 people to vote for that. So it was a pretty substantial increase for a 10% cut. And I think that gave us a lot of information about where to go and how to do this, and really to organize from the grassroots so that people are hearing from their constituents about these bills, because it's very important too. The People Over Pentagon bill does something very simple. It cuts $100 billion from what right now I believe is the $842 billion proposed budget. We've watched this budget in the past get introduced, for example, I think it was last year or the year before, by the president, get increased by Congress, not even what was asked for by the White House in working with the Department of Defense. And then that number passes. And then every time we build from that bigger number, and it just goes and goes and goes. The problem is we have a lot of problems with that defense spending. The Pentagon spending is largely that we've got problems with is what's going to contractors and how it's used and for the weapons that it buys, not so much for the salary for the people who serve in the military and the benefits for their families. That we've actually said we wouldn't cut when we pass those cut bills. Or we tried to pass those cut bills. But in reality, we spend money on so many things that don't work because we can't audit the Pentagon. They can't pass a simple audit. I was on a delegation trip in December, and we had someone with us from the budget shop in defense. And I asked her the question, I go, why can't you do something as simple as pass an audit? And her reply was that their accounting processes are so antiquated that they can't do it. Now, I don't take that as a sufficient answer, but it does tell you an awful lot. That they can't even redirect some funding for an F-35 or whatever the weapon of war is that they're probably over purchasing from what's actually required. And I'll come back to that in a second, and put money into a modern system of accounting so that we could actually have accountability. Well, part of the problem is just that on the accountability. They just can't do that. We know for a fact that we've put billions of dollars into an amphibious vehicle that only sinks. It's supposed to sink and go on land, and it stays on the bottom of the ocean. That's not what you spend billions of dollars on, yet we've done just that. We've had some medium-range missile systems that have not delivered, billions of dollars into it, started over billions of dollars more, still didn't work, billions of dollars more. There's no accountability. The current Ford class of aircraft carrier, when the toilets clog, we have to pour $400,000 worth of acids down the toilet in order to get them to flush, literally flushing money down the toilet. I don't know if there's a better living example of, I think, what we do with the Department of Defense than the $400,000 of acids to flush down a toilet, to unclog the toilets in something that's supposed to be the most recent class and the best of aircraft carriers. With all of those and many, many more examples like that, we still can't get the Pentagon budget under wraps. Here's the problem. I truly believe that this is no longer even a debate about defense spending, because I'd love to have that. The F-35 has many, 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 many problems, and we keep just pouring money in as none of those get resolved. But the real problem is this has become a jobs program in districts across the country. When you talk to other members, they talk about the military imprint that they have in their district, the defense contractors in their district. It's not about the logic of how we're spending money. It's not about the proper oversight of the misspending of money. It's about jobs in their district. And that's the problem, because we're no longer having a conversation about the defense of the nation or about the Pentagon's budget, but we're talking about the 1,000 jobs in a district, the 10,000 jobs in a district, the manufacturer who makes parts for that. Let me just give you one example of my district. I don't have a huge imprint, but I have an imprint, as does every district, of defense spending. And there's a company that makes a part. It's about as big as my pinky that goes on submarines. And every year they come in and ask me to buy more submarines than's requested by the Department of Defense, because they make a little piece for that submarine. Well, it's jobs, right? I understand that. They're trying to increase their bottom line. But when you extrapolate that among 435 plus districts, you can very quickly see why this becomes such a difficult issue. The best firepower we have back, no pun intended, is people in districts. The ability to have constituents contact their member and say, look, we need more funding for education, for healthcare, for housing, for climate change, addressing climate change. And we're putting all this money into defense contractors, and you can't even see if you're being hoodwinked. And I think when we have those conversations, that's how we saw that vote grow for a 10% cut, getting over 90 votes from just a couple of years earlier, a 1% cut getting 70 votes. So really, that's the power we have, is collectively, all of us reaching out to our members of the House and Senate and talking about that we want a right-sized defense budget, that there are real priorities in spending that we believe in, that we want to see money spent on. But it's not just one more weapon of war. It's not another failed defense program. It's not a no-bid contract, which, by the way, is an increasing thing happen with consolidation of defense contractors. We're at places now where you can only get a bid from a single contractor. Guess what? It's not a good deal because you have no competition, and we need to do more also around that. But that's the reality. We're spending money in probably the sloppiest way we do in the federal budget, and yet we're told they also can't have an audit. So in addition to the People Over Pentagon budget, you're going to see a bill introduced by Barbara Lee and I that she has introduced previously that would request and require an audit of the Defense Department. And we're putting an appropriations request in, and I'm hoping that we can convince Republicans to join us on this, because I do think this is an issue that maybe we can get some cross-party interest in, which is to have them redirect some of the funds that they have to having a modern accounting system so that they can be audited, because no one, regardless of your ideology, should want us to be wasting money. And at minimum, we should know how it's being spent, if it's being overspent, if all the guidelines are being followed. We don't do that right now, bluntly, and we've got to address that. So I just want to say thank you for being on this call. Thank you for your interest in this issue. It really is a grassroots up issue that when we reach out to our members of Congress, that's how we get the votes. That's how we got the increased strength. And I think, this year, between the $100 billion cut and the People Over Pentagon bill, the audit bill that we're going to introduce, and I think some other ideas that we're continuing to work on, I'm hoping that eventually we will be able to right-size this budget. It's going to be a tough fight. Don't forget, it's a jobs program to many members. We have to make it what it really is. It's about really spending with absolutely no checks and balances. And in the end of the day, it's not going towards the human interests that we think are most valuable and that we'd like to see money spent on. So thanks so much for having me be a part of this. And I really hope you guys have a wonderful conversation on this tonight.
Thanks so much, Representative. You all can see why he's such a great leader for us. The examples that make it sing, the pinky, the strategy to tell us what we need to do, what the problem is, and how we overcome that. We're going to follow that guideline, and we're going to talk about that more as the call goes on. Now we're thrilled to have Reverend William Barber with us from the Poor People's Campaign. Reverend Barber is under the weather. We thought he was going to cancel, but his moral strength, so he's drawing on that strength to speak with us, but he's going to be just on audio for a little while. We so appreciate all he does, but of course his willingness to jump on this call when he's really feeling pretty crummy. But I'll tell you, just from the little chit chat before we started this thing, Reverend Barber, when he's not feeling great, pretty inspirational guy. Thank you so much for being with us, Reverend. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And I have to be here with Representative that just came on, Representative Barbara Lee, and all of you who are fighting the good fight. And on behalf of my co-chair, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo O'Hara's more than 40 coordinating committees, state coordinating committees of the Poor People's Campaign, and on behalf of Repairs of the Breach that I lead as well, that helps provide organizing strength for the Poor People's Campaign. I was thinking about two passages of scripture, one in Isaiah 10, that says, "Woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights." And when we see this almost $1 trillion going toward war unnecessarily, if you cut the Pentagon budget in half, you still have more money than Iran, Iraq, Russia, China, North Korea combined. And it's a form of robbery, policy robbery. And that is a moral issue. When I look in the Bible where it says your heart is where your treasure is, or your treasure is where your heart is, the nation must hear that when we put $1 trillion into the war machinery of this nation and leave so many other things undone, it says that we care more about machinery and care more about war than we care about people. But I also want to make this point. Oftentimes we hear people talking about how sad they are when they see the casualties of war. Well, we have to talk about the casualties of underfunding things that need to be funded because we are overfunding war. 200, 700 people die every day from poverty, 250,000 people a year. If we were investing in living wages, we would be saving lives. Those 55 million people in this country make less than a living wage every day. These are hardworking people. We now know, one study said that because we've not adequately funded healthcare and provided healthcare to everyone during the highest levels of COVID, 330,000 people died, not from the germ COVID, but from the lack of health care. We know that poor people died at a rate 3 to 5 times higher during the highest levels of COVID, not because the germ discriminated, but because we discriminated in the way in which we deliver services and under-delivered services. And so there are casualties, real casualties, when we don't fund environmental justice, when we don't fund healthcare, when we don't deal with the issues of poverty that do not have to exist, when we cannot maintain something like child income tax credit because of greed. We can only do it for a little bit, lift 60% of children out of poverty for about 6 months and then drop them right back in because we'd rather put more money in the war machinery than to extend permanently child income tax credit. And it costs lives. I think we have to start talking more about the death measurement and when we don't do those things that we know we should do with housing, with education, with health care, with living wages. In fact, the Poor People's Campaign now, we're starting to do that analysis, and we're going to have a report coming out on what is the death analysis, and America is really going to have to decide that death is no longer an option, particularly when that death results from bad public policy or from funding war rather than funding life for so many people in this country. But we also have to, and I'm glad that the representative raised it as well, we have to start talking about if we have universal health care and we were to fund that, that also creates jobs. When we ensure that workers have a living wage, and it is a sin before everything I know that we forced persons, what we call service workers before COVID, we call them essential workers during COVID, and they were essential, but we treated them like expendable, made them go to work without living wages, without health care, and without paid family leave. All of those things we could fund, and that would increase jobs as well. Funding and education would increase jobs. Living wages increase jobs. Healthcare increase jobs and would put more money in the economy. So I think in this moral moment, we have to challenge this almost $1 trillion funding by attaching to it. If you do this, you must also then be held accountable for the number of lives that you destroy, the people who die because you choose to buy a tank rather than to buy a health care, because you choose to be able to blow the world up 50 times when it seems like one time is far too much anyway. That you choose to put money in something that sinks to the bottom of the sea rather than paying people a living wage so they can live and move through life with decency. This is a serious moral issue with deep policy implications. People's lives are at stake, and the long-term health of our economy and jobs are at stake when we tend to fund war and fund the war machinery rather than fund people's lives, fund healthcare, fund education, fund living wages, fund those things that make for a better democracy and a better world and a better society. So yes, people over the Pentagon. Just choose people over the Pentagon. Let's take that 100 million, redirect it in ways that will bring life to the economy, life to jobs, and will save the lives of human beings who are needlessly dying. And because I'm a preacher, we call that sin. We call that immoral. we call that unrighteous, and we can do better than that. We can establish justice, but we're going to have to change our moral priorities, especially when it comes to spending on the war machinery. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Reverend Barber. We appreciate everything you do, of course, all your leadership, all your inspiration, all your guidance, and that you dragged yourself onto this call. Extra props. We're just thrilled that you were able to join us. And as always, it's not just inspirational talk, it's informational talk, and it's directional talk, and it tells us what we need to do.
And let me call on every clergy person, and I don't care what faith you're in, every faith that I've ever read on says that we ought to care more about people's lives than we ought to care about engaging in that which destroys life. And so for this bill, let me call on as many clergy as possible to join this effort, and look for the piece that's going to be coming out soon that will do this, what we are calling the death analysis, that says public policy is not benign. Bad public policy costs people's lives, and we can no longer just talk about numbers. We're going to have to talk about the lives that are lost because we make these bad choices in spending, and that means we don't have to do it, and that life can be saved. So we're in the fight with you. We're in the fight to stay, but it's a love fight. It's a fight of faith. It's a fight of truth, and it's a fight ultimately for the lives of all people. Take care.
Thanks so much. Before we go to the next section, I want to just put out a few contextual facts and say a couple words about the strategy that we're trying to pursue to explain what it is we're doing, why we think it's going to make a difference, and why we hope everybody on the call, everybody watching this, will get engaged and get activated. First, some just quick contextual facts. The Pentagon budget, combining both the money for the Pentagon and some other agencies, in the current fiscal year, was $858 billion. $858 billion. Now, President Biden didn't suggest $858 billion. He suggested $40 billion less than that. Congress wasn't satisfied. He already was upping it from where Trump was. Congress said, no, that's not enough. Let's go all the way to $858 billion. Okay. So now in the current upcoming budget, President Biden has proposed $886 billion. Well, if things have been like they've been in the past, Congress is going to say, that's not enough. We're talking about cutting all kinds of other things, but that's not enough. So we have reason to expect that to go up. These extraordinary amounts of money, fast approaching $1 trillion, too much to fathom. We spent a lot of time talking about how do we convey what these dollars mean in some sense that people can understand it. It's an ongoing challenge for us. But one way we can do it is by just in terms of talking about our security. The United States spends more on the military than the next 9 countries combined. We spend about 10 times more on the military than Russia does. So the next dollar is not buying us any more security if you think all this spending buys security in the first place. The next dollar is not really doing anything except taking money away from other purposes. I just want to say a couple words about strategy before we move into the next portion of the discussion. You've heard this from Representative Pocan. You've heard this from Reverend Barber. The reason let's think just for a second about why we have this outrageous level of spending. As Representative Pocan said, it's not a merits decision. It's a political decision. So we have to counter the political power of the military industrial complex with our own political power. So we have to be mobilized. And the first thing to do, there's lots to do. The first thing to do is make sure your member is engaged on this. Make sure your member of Congress is co-sponsoring HR 1134, the People Over Pentagon Act. Tomorrow, call up your member. Make sure they're on this. Call the Capitol switchboard, 202-224-3121, 224-3121, and tell them you've got to sponsor the People Over Pentagon Act. Now, as Representative Pocan said, we're not on the verge of winning, right? But we have a vehicle now that can force members of Congress to take a stand, where we can force them to take a stand to cut Pentagon spending. And that's how we build power. We grow that number over time. We've got something concrete, not just complaining about how much spending there is. We've got a concrete ask. We can organize around that We can be very concrete in telling people, yeah, this is something worth leaning into because there's an outcome we can win. And if we pursue that strategy over time, we're going to build up enough power. We've already got the arguments on our side. We're going to build up enough power to actually cut the Pentagon budget. All right, let's delve into this further. We're going to talk now with Bill Hartung from the Quincy Institute, Karen Orenstein from Friends of the Earth, and Debbie Weinstein for the Coalition for Human Needs. Bill, let's start with you. Let me just introduce you by saying, for folks who don't know you, Bill is the foremost progressive expert on Pentagon spending, the expert on all the waste inside, the guy who knows the generals and the colonels and knows the stories. He's been spending a career delving into this. Bill, we only have a few minutes, so we don't have time for the book. But what do you see as the most egregious part of the Pentagon budget? If you want to say, what's the case? What's the single thing to say about what the case is to cut the Pentagon budget significantly?
Well, I think, the first thing to say is that these contractors are basically picking the pockets of the taxpayers. More than half of the Pentagon budget goes to contractors, and the top 5 get $150 to $200 billion a year. One recent year, Lockheed Martin got $75 billion, which is more than our entire State Department, which is just indicative of how militarized our foreign policy has become. You've got things like the F-35, which has 800 unresolved defects, including some that will put the pilots at risk of death. And yet they're chugging along buying these things. They're going to spend $13 billion this year. That's bigger than the whole budget of the Centers for Disease Control, far larger than the budget of the Environmental Protection Agency. Just 2 of these planes, and they want to build 2,400, just 2 of them cost enough to double what we spend on railroad safety, which, of course, after that horrific accident in Ohio, should be a top priority. We build $13 billion aircraft carriers that are vulnerable to being sunk by relatively cheap high-speed missiles. We get missile defense systems for billions and billions of dollars that have never passed a realistic test. God forbid there was an attack, but these things would be useless. They're just ways to funnel money to Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and so forth. And so I think, we could certainly cut. There's these weapons we don't need at prices we can't afford, many of which don't work. Congress has compounded the problem, as was mentioned. There's a boat called the Littoral Combat Ship, which has engine problems, doesn't meet any of its missions. Even the Navy didn't want it. And Congress, members from Florida and Virginia, where these ships are repaired, put together with the contractors to prevent the Navy from retiring ships they didn't even want. So we have to go up against this. And I think, the jobs argument is going to be key. I don't want to delve into that now. Maybe we'll get to it later. But basically, to some degree, it's a con game. There's fear involved. There's pointing fingers at other countries. But as Reverend Barber said, we could cut our budget in half and still spend far more than all U.S. designated adversaries combined. So I think we have a strong case for why there's huge amounts of waste there that doesn't defend anybody and actually makes us less safe.
Great, thank you. A lot for folks to digest, but the list of examples to make the case is unfortunately nearly endless. Karen, I want to ask you a question. When you hear this kind of recitation of the waste and you think about the extraordinary amount of dollars that goes into the Pentagon, how do you see Pentagon spending at the levels we're at harming the environment, harming the planet? And if you could have $100 billion reallocated away from the Pentagon, what could that do to take on the climate crisis?
First of all, thank you so much for that question, and thank you for having me on. Well, I want to first start out by noting that the Pentagon is actually a major driver of climate change. According to the Costs of War project at Brown University, the U.S. Department of Defense is actually the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world. It accounts for between 77% and 80% of all federal government energy consumption since 2001. So as a person coming from an environmental and a justice organization, I can say that the Pentagon is bad for the environment. war is extremely bad for the environment, for human beings, for all living things. But getting back to the money question, there is so much need for funding to address the climate emergency and so little money for it. The US government, Congress, they cry poverty when it comes to addressing climate change here at home and in developing countries. And then they spend, as we have been talking, they spend extravagantly on the military. So the cost of addressing the climate crisis is extremely expensive, but the cost of not doing so is far more. I'm going to get into a few numbers now, but they're large numbers. They're really large numbers, but they're also almost certainly underestimates. So I'll start out quickly just by explaining go over the concept of loss and damage, and that's sort of the economic and non-economic costs of climate change-driven extreme weather events like cyclones or droughts or heat waves. And then you have slow onset changes like sea level rise, desertification, ocean acidification. We're already living in an era of loss and damage. It's only going to get worse. And then low-income countries and marginalized communities within all countries, rich and poor, are bearing a disproportionate burden of the resulting losses and damages, and they're going to continue to do so. So just getting into some numbers here, the projected economic cost of just loss and damage by 2030 alone is estimated at $400 billion a year by one study, between $290 and $580 billion a year in developing countries alone in another study. And then by 2050, the economic cost of loss and damage in developing countries is estimated at between $1 and $1.8 trillion. And then those are just the economic losses, right? The non-economic losses are devastating, right? Such as the incalculable toll of losing family members, the disappearance of cultures and ways of living, the trauma of being forced to migrate from your ancestral home. And when we talk about the cost of dealing with the climate crisis, often we talk about, at least in the international context, international climate finance being made up of 1, loss and damage, 2, adaptation, which is adjustments to the unavoidable impacts of climate change, and 3, mitigation, which is just basically greenhouse gas reductions. So Friends of the Earth, along with a number of other groups in 2020, concluded that the US should be paying international climate finance contributions of at least $800 billion between 2021 and 2030. That's just a good faith down payment towards our fair share of the cost of keeping global temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we think of it as $267 billion for mitigation, $267 billion for adaptation, and $267 billion for loss and damage. Let me just tell you that we know this estimate is well below the need, right? But we said, well, we can't be left out of the room, so just $800 billion. Now, if we had $100 billion from the Pentagon's budget, we could pay for 1/8 of that, of what we owe, which we know is already too little, but it's exponentially larger than what the U.S. is providing. So yeah, we can take it and use a lot more to pay for climate change as opposed to the destruction of the planet that the military is helping to drive. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. Just so much appreciate your work and the work of Friends of the Earth. And I think the clarity you just provided and the passion and the infusion of justice and global equity is a central consideration in how we handle climate. And then to bring that into the spending of the Pentagon, I think it helps people understand what's at stake, and it brings into the conversation things that are too often neglected in the U.S. domestic conversation, to be sure. Next, I want to kick it over to Debbie Weinstein from Coalition for Human Needs, which is an organization that brings together organizations focused on what it sounds like: basic human needs, focusing on low-income people, but all people really, healthcare, education, dealing with disability. During the pandemic, but really for decades before, but during the pandemic, Coalition for Human Needs was played a heroic role in bringing together people in a crisis moment from across different sectors and identifying needs and rallying support, and actually being pretty effective at getting the federal government to do not enough, but to do quite a bit to attend to some of the urgent emergency needs that arose during the pandemic, during the acute phase of the pandemic. Of course, there were also chronic needs. And so those persist and will continue to persist until we do anything about them. So Debbie, I want to ask you a question that's comparable to what I asked Karen. All this money focused on Pentagon spending, if we were to take $100 billion and use it for our human needs, take care of people, what could we accomplish?
Muted. Thank you very much, Robert. I really, really appreciate your generous words. We all have worked together on a series of urgent moments for this country. We are still in those moments. It's a very precarious period for millions of people. And I appreciate everything that you've heard up till now. My addition, Coalition on Human Needs, as you point out, very large portfolio. I took very seriously that $100 billion and what we could be spending it on. I looked at very realistic proposals, first year towards ramping up, towards meeting our needs. And here's, a listing of some of the things you could do for that kind of money. You could set us on a path for moving from our current only helping about 1.5 million children with affordable childcare to ramp up over 10 years to meet the needs of 16 million children in low-income families and pay for universal preschool. So the first year of that, plus covering the health care of people poor adults who've been left out and denied care in the 10 states that refuse to expand the Medicaid program. So give them health coverage that they are now denied. A whole set of public health items, vaccine development, expansion of community health centers, preparation for the next pandemic. We could restore that first year of restoration of the child tax credit that Reverend Barber said, cut poverty in half, and then we let it expire. We could bring it back. We could restore the improved earned income tax credit for poor people who don't have children. We could have home care for people with disabilities and the aging, the first year of a 10-year expansion. And we could do the first year of a 10-year plan to make rental vouchers available to every eligible household, all urgently needed. And wait, there's more. You could do the first year of a plan to greatly expand free school meals for 9 million children. So all of that, I have to be honest, that comes to like 103 billion. But that gives you a sense of how many needs we could meet if we were doing the right priorities.
That's just extraordinary. Just want to give people a minute to sit with that. And I guess one thing we should say to be really clear with folks, when we're talking about $100 billion, we're talking about that every single year.
That's right.
When we talked about the Build Back Better program, the robust version, that was $3.5 trillion. But that was over 10 years, right? So we're really, if you think that you do the 10-year math that they like in Washington so much, we're actually talking about $1 trillion. It's, as they say, real money.
Right. So I did want to say I was careful with this. I did that first year expenditure to put us on a path which was highly realistic because it would not be the only year that if Congress were smart enough to do this bill, you would be able to have year after year the benefits of not, as Bill said, just throwing money at military contractors.
Well, let me follow up on one thing that came up, and Bill asked you a question on a topic that you alluded to in your comments, and Representative Pocan focused on, the idea of jobs. So we know that one of our political challenges, as Representative Pocan said, is members hear from their constituents, oh, all this spending on the Pentagon creates jobs in our district. What's the truth about that? And as advocates for cutting Pentagon spending, how should we respond?
Well, I think the first point is Pentagon spending is the worst possible way to create jobs. You can get 40% more jobs in green energy or infrastructure, almost twice as many jobs for the same amount spent in healthcare, education, and it's a diminishing asset. Even the industry has said, there's only 1/3 as many jobs building weapons as there were 30 years ago, because they're outsourcing, they're using automation, they're busting unions in some cases. So, the problem is the geopolitics of it, where they put the factories, where they put the components. As Representative Pocan said, even, this much is enough to get you lobbied. But Miriam Pemberton has done a book and also a paper for Brown Costs of War about efforts to find other ways to create jobs, things like hybrid buses and electric cars. And there have been some significant efforts at the state level to do that, but they didn't back it up with federal support, so we didn't get the full benefits of that. Heidi Peltier at Brown also did a study. If you took about $100 billion and put it in green manufacturing, you'd have a net increase of 250,000 jobs. So really keeping this money in the Pentagon is costing us jobs. It's a huge opportunity cost. And so I think, we need to turn around the priorities of this country. And when we do that, the jobs problem would be much easier to solve. So in a way, it's the same fight. This shift of money to other priorities gives us the opportunity to employ people doing other things than building weapons of destruction. And when you talk to people, there's been surveys of people in the industry, they would much rather be building solar panels or things that contribute to life rather than weapons. But they haven't been given that choice, and we have to help create that choice.
Wonderful. Debbie, let me ask you a follow-up to that list of priorities, and touches on things we've discussed earlier. As someone who fights these fights in Washington, any one of those things, why don't we have them? Well, no one thinks it's a bad idea to take care of kids. Well, a few people, but mostly not. It's always, we don't have the money for it. We don't have the money for it. How do you contextualize it for us that we don't have the money to do any one of the list of things you said, but we have more than $800 billion going on $1 trillion for the Pentagon?
Well, it seems to have a lot to do with power and money, right? And power and money is not always on our side, but it could be if we all came together and worked together in the way that you were asking us to do. And the Coalition on Human Needs is trying to be there. We have a campaign that we call Save for All, Strengthening America's Values and Economy for All, in which we have included the need to get rid of wasteful spending, and Pentagon spending is among the most egregious examples, where, Bill told us about weapon systems that are hugely, unimaginably expensive and that don't work. Those don't advance our security. They are just shoveling money where it doesn't need to go. And that is the excuse given that we have to say, sorry, we don't buy it. The needs are too urgent to get our children out of poverty, to help our aging population be able to live at home comfortably, to make sure that people have health insurance. It's an outrage to say that we cannot meet those needs. As long as we come together, it's time to say we can make this cut. Very much appreciate Representative Pocan and Representative Lee for this bill. It's not the only approach. Others have said things like, and I know Public Citizen supports this, right now it's mandatory that we ask the Pentagon for more than the president puts out in his budget, an extra wish list. And so some legislation says, get rid of that being mandatory. You said at the beginning, Rob, about how Congress adds money beyond what is even asked for. At least let's stop that. There's much that we could do if we come together.
Thanks so much. And one quick final question for the panel, over to you, Karen. So I think on the one hand, we have to be honest about the challenge we face, and we're not going to succeed if we don't recognize how hard it's going to be to defeat the military-industrial complex. So we know we're going to have to be persistent and consistent and stick with this thing. At the same time, we got to be motivated by a sense of urgency. We can't wait for it to happen sometime in the future. And I just wondered if you could give us some thoughts about the idea of urgency in this fight, especially as you think so much about the climate crisis we're facing.
Well, yeah, I can think of nothing more urgent than addressing the climate crisis. We're in a climate emergency here and now, in this country, all over the world. And as I said earlier, the less we do now, the more we pay later, both in terms of lives and livelihoods and just in terms of money. And this is not a question of resources, it's a question of priorities. And if we want a livable future for future generations, then this has to be dealt with now or yesterday, because people are dying now and they will tomorrow as well.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you to Bill and Karen and Debbie. And we're going to transition now over to the rousing conclusion of this program. These webinars aren't quite as exciting as they were at the outset of COVID. But when you get awesome people on, they're pretty good. And we've had that all the way through, and we're going to go out with a bang. We are going to hear now from the other lead sponsor of the People Over Pentagon Act, Representative Barber II from California. As most of you on this call, most of you watching this stream, most of you seeing it later will know, there is no greater champion in Congress for peace than Barber II. She's been courageous in advocating for peace throughout her entire congressional career, throughout her life. She's been courageous in talking about the issues that we've talked about on this call, the imperative of dealing with the climate crisis, the moral urgency of providing healthcare to everyone in this country, the absolute necessity of it taking on wealth inequality and making sure that we end poverty in the richest country in the earth. And like Representative Pocan, we're so honored to have her with us as both someone who's inspirational, deeply knowledgeable, and also super strategic in giving us guidance and leadership about how we move this thing forward to eventually succeed in cutting the Pentagon budget. So it's a great thrill to welcome to the conclusion of this conversation, Representative Barber II from California.
Thank you, Robert, so much. And thank you to all of our panelists and to Public Citizen. I just have to thank you for your leadership on this issue and so many other issues. And also to my colleague, Representative Pocan, and of course, Bishop Barber, because it is just remarkable in terms of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. And let me just tell you a couple of things, just a bit about my past. Many of you know I worked for one of the greatest members of Congress ever, Congressman Ron Dellums. Ron was on the Armed Services Committee, and of course we come from Oakland and Berkeley, the East Bay. So if there are any East Bay folks in the house, so happy you're here, because you all know this is the heart and soul of the peace movement, and Ron led that movement. He was the first African-American chair to chair the Armed Services Committee. And with regard to Pentagon spending, there was no one greater than Ron Dellums. He actually, during his chairmanship, took amendments. He was very respectful of reasonable amendments, but he would always vote against his bill. And it was because of the funding levels. And he knew exactly what all of you are talking about today, that this Pentagon budget is increasing excessively to the point where we will not have any funding for domestic priorities. He knew, and we know, that the defense budget is grossly inflated, and that our communities, and I was listening to some of the panelists, Debbie, good to see you, that our communities are chronically underfunded and have been for so long. And the driver of this, in many ways, is the Pentagon budget. And so, yes, I introduced the bill with Congressman Pocan because I know, first of all, the vast majority of Americans would agree that it's unacceptable for the Pentagon to lose billions, first of all, the taxpayer dollars per year, year after year, with no accountability. No agency in the history of this country has ever failed an audit. The Pentagon has failed 5 times, 5 audits. With each annual budget, this country is inching closer and closer to a $1 trillion defense budget. The budget for fiscal F-35s, for example, is greater than the budget for the entire Center for Disease Control. But we can make a difference. And reports by the bipartisan committee, if you haven't talked about this, the Congressional Budget Office, it showed that reducing our defense budget by a minimum of $100 billion. Of course, we know we can get up to $350 or $400, but just $100 billion could have a massive impact without sacrificing our national security. With $100 billion, we could provide every household with solar energy. We could hire 1 million elementary school teachers. We could provide free tuition for 2 out of 3 public college students. We could cover medical care for 7 million veterans and so much more. So as it stands now, our budget is unethical and it's immoral. Adding to the Pentagon slush fund, and there is a slush fund, and part of it is a slush fund. Year after year, it's a moral disgrace. And so I am confident with your grassroots support and advocacy, we can convince my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to reverse this trajectory and start spending money on people, not the Pentagon. And yes, last year, I had the amendment to cut the budget down to just where the Biden administration was when they presented, and Democrats and Republicans voted to add, what was it, 40 billion above what the president and the Pentagon asked for? Outrageous. How could that happen? So with my amendment, I think we got over 100 and something, 130, maybe 140 votes, but every Democrat should have voted for that. And so I think you see the problem. A lot of it has to do with where the military contracts site their plants and their manufacturing bases close to members' districts. And of course, the jobs issue is one issue that they always tout around when we know that a peace dividend still exists and we can create more good paying union jobs in solar energy and in the green economy if in fact we reduce defense spending and create jobs, good paying jobs that don't rely on the manufacturing of bombs and missiles. So I'll stop now and just say thank you very much. I hope we get at least maybe 150 votes this year to cut it by 100 billion. But I tell you one thing, each and every year we've got to do this because sooner or later, I'm thinking about Ron now, sooner or later, the rest of the country will catch up with us when the bottom begins to fall out. And people start beginning to wonder what is going on in terms of their taxpayer dollars going down this really unfortunate hole where it's failed 5 audits. So use that number because taxpayers need to understand that they're paying taxes for a budget that has failed the audits 5 times. That's a shame and disgrace.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Representative Lee, for those comments and for sponsoring this legislation and of course, for all you do.
I couldn't do it without Public Citizen and all of you, believe you me. So this is a we thing. We've got to do this to save the planet. That's what it's about.
Yeah, that's right. And let's just go out and talk about that for just one moment and we're going to wind up. So when Barbara Lee gives you instructions, you got to do it, right? So the instruction is to get activated. And that means call your member of Congress and tell them to make sure that they are co-sponsoring HR 1134, the People Over Pentagon Act. You don't have that number tattooed on your arm. Call the Capitol switchboard. It's 202-224-3121. And it's not an empty act. I just want to say this as we close. If you ask me, what's the reason that this irrational, immoral budget is so locked in, that it's on an endless trajectory up, despite endless arguments against doing it, and basic common sense, and so many competing needs. Why does that happen? So the answer is, yeah, of course, it's the power of the military-industrial complex. But beyond that, or before that, I would say the biggest thing is we don't talk about the Pentagon budget enough. It gets a free pass. Right. It gets a free pass in Washington. We're going to have this huge debate about what we do with our budget. And we're not really going to talk about the Pentagon at all. It's completely siphoned off. And that's, of course, that's a reflection of the power of the military-industrial complex. But the first thing we have to do is force that conversation. And this legislation, 1134, the People Over Pentagon Act, it is the vehicle for us to start that conversation, not to start it, but of course, to continue it and elevate it. That's why the bill is so important. It gives us a way to organize. It gives us a way to talk to our neighbors, our colleagues, our family, our members of Congress, our reporters, our editors, their local TV people, all these things. There's a real thing to talk about now. You have a bill from Representative Barber II and Mark Pocan. Every member should be on it. Everybody should be talking about it. We've got to force the conversation about this immoral, irrational spending. And when we do that, we're actually going to be quite a ways along the way to winning this fight, which I will say, singing from the hymnal with Representative Lee, we are going to win.
And Robert, when we fight, we win. Don't forget that.
That's it. That's it. When we fight, we win. All right, everybody. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you joining us. We appreciate what you're going to do. We're going to be in touch with you if we know who you are, if you're connected to this stream. If we don't know who you are and you're just watching it, please get in touch with Public Citizen or get in touch with any of the organizations on the call, Friends of the Earth, Coalition for Human Needs, the Quincy Institute. We want to get connected. As we get connected, that's how we build our power. That's how we do the fight. And that is, as Representative Lee said, how we win. Thanks, everybody. Good night.